When they burned his home, they lit the wrong match. Now he's the fire that's coming for them. The sky hadn't yet decided if it was night or morning. A thin band of grey pressed against the far hills, hinting at the promise of dawn. But for Colt Mercer, it came too late. The smell hit first, acrid, sweet in the way rot could be sweet. Smoke, not from a hearth, but from something darker, something deliberate. Colt jolted upright from his pallet of worn pelts, blinking against the shadows that danced along the cabin's log walls. The soft glow under the doorway was no morning light. It pulsed orange, alive, growing. He stumbled to the door barefoot, the chill of the dirt floor sharp against his soles, and yanked it open. A wall of heat struck him. The porch was already engulfed. Sparks flew like angry fireflies. The barn out back was nothing but bones of flame, and the corral had collapsed on itself in a screech of timber. He didn't shout. Not right away. Shock held him still. Then he saw it. The blue-stitched shawl Emma used to wear, draped over the rocking chair he'd made her, now catching flame like paper. The fire licked its way across the frame, devouring the last peaceful thing in his life. "Emma!" he shouted, the name tearing from his throat more out of instinct than hope. But she wasn't there. Hadn't been for weeks. She lay buried beneath a hand-carved cross near the edge of the tree line, taken by a fever that swept through their corner of the valley like a thief in the night. He'd nursed her, watched her fade, held her hand as her breath slowed. He'd dug her grave with his own hands. She had died in peace. But now even her memory wasn't safe. Colt backed away from the collapsing cabin, shielding his face as the flames roared higher. Smoke rolled out in thick clouds, swallowing the sky. His skin prickled with heat and grief. He fell to his knees beside the only thing left standing, the scorched, soot-covered grave marked Emma M., beloved and brave. Ash landed on her cross like black snow. Colt reached for it with trembling fingers, brushing away the dirt until he found what he didn't know he was looking for, the locket she'd once worn. It had fallen from his belt pouch during the chaos. Inside, the charcoal sketch portrait of Emma still smiled, untouched by the fire's reach. He clutched it tightly and looked around, at the ruin, at the burning sky, at the trees that stood as silent witnesses. And then he saw the mark, carved into the bark of a sycamore just beyond the clearing, BC. At first, it didn't register. But then rage surged like a kick to the chest. Boone Cavanaugh. The name was carved not just into the tree, but into Colt's memory. Boone, the man who fancied himself a marshal, a preacher, a judge, who ran Clearwater Ridge like a kingdom, who sent men to raid the homesteads of those who refused his vision, who wanted to drive out the impure, the dissenters, the godless, including anyone who dared to shelter the wounded, the outcast, the different. Colt had refused Boone's demands. He'd harbored 2 wounded Apache boys the winter before. He'd spoken out at town meetings. He'd said Boone's justice reeked of blood and power, and now he was paying the price. Colt's jaw tightened as he pushed himself up, slow and unsteady. His feet bled where they'd scraped across broken glass and hot ash, but he didn't notice. Not really. He was already somewhere else, his mind pacing through names, faces, places where Boone's men would be now, laughing, toasting, thinking it done. But it wasn't done. It had only just begun. He walked to the grave and knelt, brushing a hand over the cross. He pressed the locket to the dirt and whispered, "I won't leave you behind, Emma. Not in spirit. But I need both hands now." He buried the locket at the base of the cross, a silent vow, then stood and walked back toward what remained of the barn. Inside, beneath the rubble, he found what he needed, a rifle, scorched but intact, a knife wrapped in oiled cloth, a saddlebag with enough cartridges and jerky for a few days. And then there was the coat, his old military coat from the war, faded Union blue beneath years of dust. He shrugged into it, wincing at the blisters on his back, and stepped outside. The sun was rising now, casting long fingers of gold across the valley. The fire behind him crackled, spitting embers into the morning air. Colt mounted his horse, Cinder, the only creature that hadn't bolted in the chaos, and turned westward, to Clearwater Ridge, to Boone Cavanaugh. They'd burned his home thinking it would silence him, but all they did was light a fuse that had been waiting for years to reach the powder. And now, the fire was coming. The road to Clearwater Ridge was long and blistered with silence. Colt Mercer rode through the skeletal remains of old mining camps, sun-bleached bones of oxen scattered along abandoned wagon paths, and forests where even the birds seemed afraid to sing. The world felt emptied out, burned over, like it had already seen too much fire and was holding its breath for what came next. On the evening of the third day, he spotted smoke curling from a hollow in the land, thin and cautious, not wild and wicked like what had stolen his home. It was the town of Dry Bluff, half forgotten by the maps and almost fully erased from memory. Once a supply post during the war, it had dwindled to a few buildings, a dying saloon, and a smithy that hadn't changed its hammer in a decade. Colt guided Cinder down the narrow path into town. As he passed, faces peeked from behind lace curtains and warped shutters. No one waved. No one called out. Dry Bluff wasn't the kind of place that asked questions. It had seen too many men ride in with hollow eyes and ride out in pine boxes. Outside the blacksmith shed, a wiry man with soot-streaked arms and a limp wiped his hands on a canvas rag and squinted through the smoke. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, "Colt Mercer." Colt dismounted and gave a slow nod. Didn't think anyone here remembered. The man approached, cane dragging in dust behind him. His name was Harlan Grady, a former Union artificer who'd once built cannons from scrap iron and cursed louder than the shells ever boomed. He had one good leg and one iron one, fused at the knee like a rusted hinge. "Hard to forget a man who stopped a cavalry charge with a shovel and a bottle of turpentine," Harlan said, tapping his cane against the dirt. "But I reckon you ain't here to reminisce." "I need iron," Colt replied. "Something fast, reliable." Harlan tilted his head toward the shop. "What'd you do, son?" "They burned my home," Colt said plainly. Silence settled like dust between them. "Boone?" Harlan asked after a beat. Colt didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. "Come inside," Harlan said, pushing open the creaking door. Inside, the air was thick with oil and old sweat. Tools hung like sleeping bats from every beam. A half-finished stove sat beside what looked like a modified Gatling mount. But what Colt sought was simpler, familiar. "I've still got your old repeater," Harlan said, pulling back a burlap cloth. "You left it here back when Emma was pregnant. Said you were done with killing." "I thought I was," Colt replied. He ran his fingers along the metal. It was heavier than he remembered, but solid, like waking an old dog that still knew how to bite. "Boone's got the ridge locked down," Harlan warned. 30 riders on patrol, more in town, and they ain't the drunk fools from before. These boys wear tin stars and quote scripture. You show your face." "I won't," Colt said, pulling the weapon toward him. "Not until the time is right." Harlan grunted. "And what happens when it is? I burn the rot out." They worked in silence as the sun dipped. Harlan cleaned the chamber while Colt loaded cartridges. They spoke little. Men like them didn't need words when the task was clear. Justice didn't care for speeches. Later, Colt bedded down in the back of the smithy beneath a window that let in slivers of moonlight. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shawl curling in flame, the initials burned into the bark. Emma's locket buried in dirt too shallow for forgetting. By morning, he was gone. Harlan awoke to a note nailed to the door. "I'll be back when the sky turns black. CM." Clearwater Ridge rose like a cathedral in the dust. Once a trading hub, it now wore the polished mask of civility over a skeleton of fear. Neat signs hung from shops. The church bells chimed on time. The sheriff's office bore a fresh coat of white paint. But underneath, the town was held together with threats and bodies. Boone Cavanaugh sat atop it all like a spider in its web. His face was the kind you didn't forget. angular, with pale blue eyes that didn't blink enough. He wore his badge high and his morals low. To the churchgoers and landowners, he was the savior of the valley. To everyone else, he was just a man with an army and a Bible he'd carved into his own gospel. He stood on the steps of the courthouse that morning, surveying his domain as townsfolk passed by with lowered eyes. His brother Wade chewed tobacco beside him, spitting with lazy accuracy into a pail. The third brother, Jeb, paced with nervous energy, fingering the butt of his revolver like a child clinging to a toy. "Mercer's alive," Boone said without turning. "You sure?" Jeb asked. "Thought the fire?" "I'm never wrong," Boone said flatly. He turned and stepped down into the dirt street, walking slow, calculated, the way only a man who never feared consequence could walk. "Find him," Boone told his brothers. "I want him seen. I want the people to know. When you defy order, you end in smoke." "Want him dead?" Wade asked. "No," Boone said. "Not yet." He smiled then, a slow, curdled thing. "We're going to make an example." Far above, from the ledge overlooking the town, Colt watched, hidden between boulders, spyglass in hand, rifle at the ready. He saw Boone's every move, the fake charm, the threat behind the smirk. The men who once drank with him now bowed to a man who set fire to widows and called it salvation. Colt's jaw clenched. He wouldn't strike today. Not yet, but the match had been lit, and soon Boone would see. The fire wasn't finished. It was only waiting for the wind. The land between Clearwater Ridge and the high plateau was a dry throat of red soil and yellow grass, scattered with the husks of failed farms and windmills that no longer turned. Colt Mercer had followed a narrow deer trail along the rim of the valley until he came upon a crumbling fence, half swallowed by sagebrush. Beyond it, a modest house clung to the earth like it didn't trust the sky. The paint had long since peeled, and the front porch leaned like an old man with a bad hip. But the chimney smoked, and in the field nearby, a small herd of goats munched nervously at what little green remained. Life, it seemed, still clung here. He stopped short when the glint of iron caught his eye. There, behind a stacked pile of wood, the barrel of a rifle peeked out, still as death. "I don't take kindly to unannounced visitors," a voice called, sharp, female. Colt raised both hands, stepping clear of his horse. "Not looking for trouble," he said. "Just water and maybe a place to rest." A pause. Then the barrel lowered, only slightly. "Everyone who shows up says that," she muttered. From behind the woodpile emerged a woman, maybe 30, dressed in a faded tan shirt and men's trousers cinched with a rope belt. Her boots were scuffed and practical. Her dark blonde hair was tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years. But her eyes, those were steel, and they didn't blink once. "I'm Colt Mercer," he said. She didn't answer, just studied him a moment. Then, "I know who you are." Colt's heart paused. "Boone's been sniffing around here lately," she added. "Asking about you. Heard your name burned into a sycamore tree outside what's left of your home. That hit like a slap. And you didn't turn me in?" She narrowed her eyes. "If I was gonna turn you in, you'd already be hogtied in the back of their wagon." Colt nodded. "Appreciate the restraint." She lowered the rifle fully now. "Name's Mara DeWitt. You can water your horse at the well. She pointed the barrel again briefly. "You can stay the night. Barn's empty, but don't mistake hospitality for friendship. I've buried too many folks already." Colt gave a curt nod, respecting the distance she clearly needed. "That makes two of us." That night, Colt sat in the barn, chewing jerky and staring through a crack in the wall at the moonlit house. The goats had quieted, and the wind sighed through the slats like a ghost pacing outside. He couldn't sleep. The scent of smoke still clung to his coat. The image of Emma's grave, half covered in ash, returned uninvited every time he closed his eyes. He stood and paced the length of the barn, hands clenched, mind racing. Then he heard it. Footsteps. He turned, hand instinctively reaching for the knife strapped to his boot. But it was Mara, standing in the doorway, holding a chipped enamel mug in one hand and a shotgun in the other. "Coffee," she said, "and questions." He took the mug carefully. "Thank you." She leaned against the post, keeping the gun pointed at the floor, but still within reach. "So," she began, "why'd they burn your house?" Colt looked into the coffee like it might show him the answer. "I sheltered 2 wounded Apache boys last winter. They couldn't have been older than 16. Boone called it treason, said I was protecting savages. I told him they were just boys. And that's all it took? That's all Boone ever needed." Mara looked off into the dark. "He killed my husband," she said flatly, 2 years ago. Claimed Asa was rustling cattle from Kavanaugh land, shot him in the back, left his body in the ditch like a warning." Colt said nothing. There were no words that fixed that kind of pain. "I tried to speak up," she continued. "No one would back me. They were too scared or too loyal or too greedy. I buried Asa myself, then learned how to shoot. Boone's men haven't dared set foot on this farm since." Colt studied her face in the dim light. Beneath the grit, there was sorrow, but no fear, just a controlled fire, like coals waiting for wind. "You ever think about taking the fight to him?" Colt asked quietly. She looked at him then. "Every damn day." By morning, they were allies. Unspoken but understood. Colt spent the next day helping Mara reinforce her fence and dig new lines for irrigation. She watched him closely at first. His hands, his posture, the way he scanned the horizon like a man who didn't expect to grow old. But over time, something softened. He worked with quiet purpose, never asking for anything, and never flinching when the past crept into conversation. After supper, Mara laid out a crude map on the kitchen table. It was drawn on a scrap of flour sack with names written in charcoal. Ranches, paths, watering holes, outposts, all surrounding Clearwater Ridge. "I've been marking them since Asa died," she said. "Boone's allies, supply lines, patrol routes. I don't have the firepower to strike, but I've kept eyes on them." Colt leaned in. "This is gold. I'm guessing you got a plan." "I'm building one," he said, "but I'll need help. And not just from you." She raised an eyebrow. "You got friends out here?" He shook his head. "Not anymore. But I know where to find those who lost more than they ever dared speak." Mara looked at him for a long moment, then said, "If we do this, there's no going back. Boone won't stop. He'll burn the earth to salt before letting someone rise against him." Colt's voice was quiet, but certain. "Then we'll show him what real fire looks like." Outside, the wind began to howl, a dry sound that swept across the plains like a warning. And in the dark, 2 people who had lost everything began to plan how to take it back. Colt Mercer stood at the edge of a ridge just before sunrise, the dry wind pulling at the tails of his coat like a preacher's robe. Below him, the lowlands stretched out in golden-brown waves, dotted with lonely pines and the occasional column of dust from a passing rider. Somewhere far to the west, past those hills, Boone Kavanaugh sat on a throne built from intimidation, guarded by men with shotguns and morals purchased like cattle. But Colt wasn't thinking about Boone. Not yet. He was thinking about the letter. After parting ways with Mara that morning, he'd ridden to a hidden alcove behind a cluster of red rock formations, what locals called Widow's Hollow. It had once been a refuge for deserters during the war, a place where neither flag reached. Now, it held a rusted tin box buried under a cairn of stones. Inside the box was the past. Colt sat cross-legged in the dirt and laid the contents before him. A yellowed photograph of him and Emma standing outside their first homestead, smiles awkward and honest, a folded U.S. cavalry discharge paper creased from too many readings, and a letter, unopened, sealed with wax, addressed in his wife's handwriting. He hadn't found the courage to read it until now. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal. "Colt, if you're reading this, it means I've gone where I can't follow you anymore. And that breaks my heart more than any fever ever could. I know you. I know the fire inside you. It's what made me love you. But Colt, Please don't let it consume you after I'm gone. Don't let what they did turn you to ash too. Build, live, find light, even in the dark places. But if you can't, if they make it so you truly can't, then you burn the rot from this world like the wildfire you are. I won't blame you, not one bit. With all I was and ever will be, Emma. Colt sat motionless for several minutes. The letter crumpled slightly in his hands. There were no tears, not anymore. His grief had turned inward, molten. What he felt now was a kind of clarity, cold and absolute. Emma knew who he was, knew what had been lit inside him, and still, she loved him. He folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat, over his heart. He would not bury this. Later that day, Colt returned to Dry Bluff and found Harlan Grady hunched over a barrel of boiling pitch. The blacksmith looked up with narrowed eyes. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have," Colt said. He dropped a leather pouch on the table with a metallic clink. Inside were bullets, modified, carved with small grooves and marked with tiny crosses on the base. Harlan raised an eyebrow. "Still using holy bullets, huh?" "They're not for prayer," Colt replied. "They're for remembrance." Harlan sighed and nodded, setting aside his tongs. "Well, you picked the right time. There's been talk. Boone's men are spreading out, extorting the outposts between here and the river, looking for sympathizers. They're getting bold, or desperate," Colt said. "They know something's coming." "You mean you?" "No," Colt said, eyes sharp. "Us." That night, in a shack lit by kerosene and war memories, Colt and Harlan pored over Mara's hand-drawn map. Every circle marked a Boone-controlled asset, farms seized under moral corruption laws, old banks now used to store militia funds, roadblocks patrolled by loyalist riders. Colt traced his finger across a dotted path leading into the canyon gorge. "Here, Griffin's Pass. If we cut it off, we bottle their eastbound reinforcements." "Explosives?" Harlan asked. "Black powder," Colt said. "Same trick we used at Fort Stockton." Harlan whistled. "Hell, that's been years. Just needs one good spark," Colt said. He looked up at the old smith. "You still got that gutload cannon rig you were welding into a cart?" Harlan grinned. "Boy, I never throw anything away." But before war came planning. Colt traveled under darkness to the outskirts of Clearwater Ridge. He moved like a whisper through sleeping farms, listening, watching. A boy no older than 10 handed him a rolled paper beneath a laundry sheet. An old woman slipped him a canteen with a folded prayer inside. They knew who he was. They didn't call his name, but their eyes said it. They remembered the fire. He marked off allies, silent ones, people who had been forced into silence but hadn't forgotten the truth. These were the cracks in Boone's fortress, and Colt would drive his blade into every one of them. But not all cracks stayed cracks. Some people turned. One night, while camped beneath a limestone overhang, Colt awoke to the crunch of gravel. He drew his rifle, slow and silent, and waited. A silhouette emerged, broad-shouldered, confident. "Easy," the man said. "I come alone." It was Jed Tillman, a former Union scout turned schoolteacher. He used to ride with Colt during the war, but now wore clean boots and a reluctant frown. "They know you're back," Jed said. "Boone's got a bounty on your head, $200, dead or alive. And Mara DeWitt's name's on the poster too." Colt's blood chilled. "Then it started," Jed nodded grimly. "They say you're building a rebellion." "You?" Colt didn't blink. "I'm building a reckoning." Jed hesitated. "You'll get people killed." "They're already dying," Colt said. "Just more quietly." Jed looked away, ashamed. "Boone's got the preacher, the banker, even the undertaker. He's got the town by the throat." Colt rose to his feet, standing tall against the firelight. "Then it's time someone brings a blade to the neck." The next day, the sun rose over 3 men riding east with black powder tucked into saddlebags and grim purpose etched into their faces. The past had burned Colt Mercer's home. Now he would show them that fire remembers, and it doesn't forgive. Griffin's Pass was a cruel stretch of rock and wind, sharp ridges, narrow turns, and cliff edges that seemed to whisper invitations to fall. A man could ride through it in a day if he had reason to rush, but one wrong step and he'd become buzzard feed. The land itself didn't forgive, and Colt Mercer was counting on that. At the edge of the pass, hidden behind a fallen boulder shaped like a crouched beast, Colt knelt beside Harlan Grady and a younger man named Leo Finch, a quiet trapper whose family Boone had evicted under false charges of land mismanagement. Leo had nothing left but his powder, his traps, and a stare that didn't blink. Colt hadn't asked him to help. The boy had followed him anyway. Before them, the narrow road curved between two vertical walls of rock, the perfect choke point. Colt unrolled a small burlap sack and pulled out sticks of black powder wrapped in oilskin, each with a fuse trimmed to a careful length. Harlan eyed the setup warily. "Feels like we're waking up the devil," the old smith muttered. "We're not," Colt said. "We're sending him an invitation." They worked in silence, fingers moving with the steady confidence of men who had nothing left to lose. Colt packed the charges deep in the rocks, covered the wires with loose shale, and marked the trigger line with a scratch on the wall, one only he would notice. Just before dawn, Leo gave a low whistle. "Riders," he said. Colt moved to the overlook and pressed his spyglass to his eye. Dust trailed along the horizon. 8 riders, 2 wagons. He recognized the lead man, Wade Cavanaugh, Boone's younger brother, arrogant, cruel, too eager to prove he was more than the second son. Colt's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a supply run. Wade had brought gold. He saw it glinting under the canvas tarp, and he had brought men willing to kill for it. Colt turned to Harlan. "Time it." Harlan nodded and ducked behind the ignition crank, adjusting the rope with care. Colt crouched beside Leo, loading his rifle with steady hands. "Once the first blast hits, we move," Colt said. "We take out any riders who survive, leave the wagons, let 'em wonder what we were after." Leo nodded. "We're ghosts." "No," Colt said. "We're fire." The wagons reached the pass. Colt raised his hand, paused, dropped it. Harlan yanked the crank. A thunderclap shattered the morning. Flames burst from both cliff faces as the charges went off in succession, rock and dust raining down like judgment. The lead wagon pitched sideways, the horses screaming and tearing their reins free. One of the riders was flung like a rag doll into the gorge. The others scrambled, trying to orient themselves in the chaos. Colt didn't hesitate. He rose from cover and fired, one clean shot, straight through the chest of a man reaching for his rifle. Leo followed, dropping another with a quick, sharp crack of his lever action. Wade Cavanaugh was alive. Pinned beneath the edge of the second wagon, his leg twisted and bleeding. He reached for a pistol, but dropped it when he saw Colt step into view. "You," he gasped, "you're supposed to be dead," Colt said, voice flat. He raised his rifle and stepped closer. Wade's breath came fast. "It wasn't me. Boone gave the order. Colt pressed the barrel against Wade's knee and fired. Not to kill, but to mark. Wade screamed, curling into the dirt. Colt leaned down and whispered, "Tell your brother this is how it begins." Then he turned and walked away. By midday, the entire canyon smelled of sulfur and blood. Leo and Harlan had collected what ammunition they could and vanished down a side trail they'd scouted 2 nights earlier. Colt lingered only long enough to light a fuse on the remaining powder stashed beneath the overturned wagon. As the second explosion echoed through the pass, Colt rode east, dust curling behind him like smoke from a fire not yet seen. Boone Cavanaugh stood in his office with a glass of bourbon in one hand and a telegram in the other. His fingers were white around the edges of the paper. The words were short and cold. "Ambush at Griffin's. Wade injured. 2 dead. Gold gone. He's back." Jeb Boone read it twice, then once more. He didn't speak, didn't move, until he calmly walked to the fireplace and tossed the telegram in. The flames swallowed the words, but they didn't touch his expression. He turned to Jeb, who stood stiff and pale by the door. "Send word to Rex Harlan," Boone said. Jeb blinked. The bounty hunter? No, Boone said. The exterminator. 3 days later, a new poster appeared on every saloon wall, jailhouse window, and church bulletin board in Clearwater Ridge and every town for 20 miles around. Wanted Colt Mercer, dead or alive. $500, arson, treason, murder, insurrection. Next to Colt's name was another. Wanted Mara DeWitt, accomplice to terror. Boone's message was clear. This was no longer a manhunt. This was war. That night, Colt stood by a creek, washing blood from his hands. His knuckles ached, his chest burned with something deeper than rage. He looked up at the stars and muttered Emma's name under his breath. I kept my word, he whispered. I'll keep it till the end. He didn't know how long he stood there, listening to the hush of the water. But when he turned back toward the hills, he wasn't alone. Mara sat on her horse, rifle slung across her lap. They put my name on your bounty, she said. Colt nodded. You still want out? Mara pulled her bandana over her face, eyes gleaming. No, she said. I want in. In the heart of Mesquite Valley, where the land burned red and even the rattlesnakes moved like ghosts, a man sat beneath a crooked mesquite tree, sharpening a knife that looked older than most towns west of the Mississippi. Rex Harlan didn't speak often. He didn't smile. He didn't threaten. But when his name appeared on a telegram, people stopped sleeping right. He had once been a bounty hunter, then a soldier, then something darker. Nobody knew exactly what turned him. Some said he watched his family burn during the war. Others said he lit the fire himself. Either way, he was the kind of man you only sent when you didn't want someone found. You wanted them erased. The telegram had come from Boone's personal seal. Name, Colt Mercer. Reward, $500 alive. $750 if he resists. No questions asked. Find him. Break him. Burn what's left. Rex folded the telegram neatly and slipped it into his satchel. He wiped the blade clean on the dirt, rose without a sound, and rode west. Meanwhile, Colt and Mara made camp inside a hollow ravine, shielded by rock and silence. The sun had dropped behind the ridge, leaving streaks of purple and gold across the sky. Colt cleaned his rifle, while Mara boiled coffee over a small fire buried in the sand. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Mara broke the quiet. You think Boone'll send someone after us? Colt didn't look up. He already has. She paused. You mean his men? Colt shook his head. No, I mean someone worse. Someone like Rex Harlan. The name made Mara flinch just slightly. You know him? Colt asked. Everyone knows him. The man cuts throats for coin and never once looks a man in the eye while he does it, Colt nodded. He looks at the dirt, like he's already digging your grave. They sat in silence, the fire crackling like dry bones. Colt reached into his coat and pulled out Emma's letter. Mara watched him carefully as he read it again, lips not moving, just eyes fixed. She told me not to become this, Colt said. Not unless I had no choice. And do you? Colt's fingers tightened around the page. I stopped having choices when Boone lit the match. Mara leaned back against her saddle. Then we fight. But neither of them knew that the fight was already moving toward them. Rex Harlan tracked them like a hound bred for it. He rode without stopping through the foothills, questioned no one, left behind no trace. He found the remnants of the ambush at Griffin's Pass and studied the blast patterns in silence. He sniffed the powder in the air, inspected the angle of the wagon ruts, and picked up a single bullet casing. Harlan iron, he muttered. Blacksmith from Dry Bluff. He turned his horse south. He knew the land like the back of his weathered hands, and he knew Colt Mercer wouldn't stay still. Not now. Not with fire in his belly and blood on his boots. 2 days later, he arrived at the DeWitt homestead. The fence had been repaired. The goats were gone. The house stood empty, but not forgotten. Rex dismounted, walked through the door without knocking, and ran a hand across the wooden table. Dusty, but not layered. Someone had eaten here recently. He crouched beside the fireplace and found footprints leading out the back. Still warm, he whispered. He stood, left the house, and torched it. No anger, no message, just fire. He watched it burn until the roof collapsed, then rode on. In a saloon halfway between Dry Bluff and the Ridge, a man named Clayton Boyd drank himself into a stupor. He was a ranch hand with bad teeth, bad debts, and worse friends. 2 weeks earlier, Colt had spared his life during a standoff, knocking the gun from his hand instead of killing him. Clayton hadn't forgotten the humiliation. So when Rex Harlan walked into the saloon and laid down a gold coin and a sketch of Colt's face, Clayton's lips got loose. "I seen him," he said, leaning forward with whiskey breath. "Saw him near Widow's Hollow. He's got a woman with him too. Shoots better than most men." Rex didn't say a word. He just nodded and turned to leave. Clayton leaned back, proud. "You gonna kill 'em both?" Rex paused at the door, then looked over his shoulder. "No," he said. "I'm gonna let them think they're winning." That same night, Colt and Mara infiltrated an old mail outpost guarded by 3 of Boone's men. They waited until dusk, then struck with precision. Colt taking the left flank, Mara the right. The first man fell with a choke wire. The second was dropped by a shot to the knee, followed by Mara's boot to his temple. The third tried to run, but found Colt waiting with a knife at the edge of the brush. They didn't kill them. Not yet. Instead, they left them tied to a post with the word "Thieves" painted in red across their shirts. In the supply shed, they found crates of tinned meat, ammunition, and something more valuable than gold: maps, patrol schedules, a list of Boone's informants. "This changes everything," Mara said, flipping through the notes. Colt agreed. "Now we're not just surviving, we're maneuvering." But as they rode off with their stolen goods, neither of them noticed the mark scratched into the post outside the shed, a symbol that looked like a jagged R carved into the wood. Rex Harlan had been there, and he had let them win. Days passed. Small victories piled up like kindling, a sabotaged railcar here, a collapsed bridge there, townsfolk rising in whispers of rebellion. Colt's name spread like a ghost story. The Firewalker, some called him. The Widow's Shadow, others whispered, hinting at Mara's partnership. But beneath every success, Rex moved closer, watching, waiting, learning their patterns. He knew it wasn't time yet. Not until Colt trusted the fire he was building. Not until he believed he was changing the course of fate, because that's when men made mistakes. That's when the knife could slip between the ribs and twist. One evening, in a clearing lit by fireflies and hope, Colt stood by Mara as she spoke to a group of exiles. Farmers, wives of hanged men, railroaders who had lost their jobs to Boone's moral cleansings. They all looked tired, worn, but they listened. Mara's voice cut through the night. "We're not just fighting to live. We're fighting so the next generation won't have to hide their names or bury their dead without justice. Boone Kavanaugh burned our homes. Now it's time we burn down his lies." They cheered, quietly, but they cheered. And in the trees beyond, unseen by all, Rex Harlan smiled, because the match had been lit, and soon he would be the wind. Clearwater Ridge dressed itself in righteousness that Sunday morning. The bells rang early, loud, and without pause. They echoed through dusty alleys and empty homes, summoning the fearful and the obedient to the town's one standing church, St. Elijah's, a white-painted structure with a tall steeple and a cross too clean to be honest. Boone Kavanaugh had chosen it carefully, not because he cared for sermons, but because of what the building meant to those still clinging to faith. He stood on the steps in a black coat, polished boots gleaming like onyx under the rising sun, a Bible in one hand, a rifle in the other. Behind him, 20 of his men stood in 2 rows, uniformed in matching dusters, tin stars pinned over their hearts like shields made of lies. They weren't lawmen, they were loyalists, mercenaries blessed by fear. Boone raised his voice before the crowd of trembling townsfolk. "Today," he announced, "we pray not for peace, but for purity." Gasps swept the crowd like a cold wind. This town has become infested with rebellion, men who spit on law, women who consort with traitors, those who believe justice is found at the end of a rifle. He raised the Bible high. But I tell you now, Clearwater Ridge belongs to God, and we will cleanse it with fire if we must. He stepped aside. Behind him, the church doors opened. 6 people stood bound inside the sanctuary. 2 were farmers who had fed Colt Mercer's allies. 1 was the mother of a boy Colt had helped escape a patrol. The others were guiltless except by association, neighbors of the wrong kind, witnesses of the wrong truths. Boone's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. These are your neighbors, your friends, your kin, but they have chosen fire over faith. Then, to the horror of all watching, Boone struck a match. He didn't light the church. Not yet. He lit the corner of a banner draped across the front pew, letting the flames crawl. Slow, intentional, symbolic. Fear first, flames later. Then came the moment he didn't expect. Gunfire. 1 shot, then 2, from the bell tower. A man fell from Boone's line of guards, clutching his throat. A second dropped with a hole through his chest. Screams erupted, and the crowd scattered like leaves in a gale. Boone turned, eyes scanning the rooftops, rage rising like bile. "Mercer!" he growled. Because who else would dare? From his perch inside the rafters of the abandoned tannery across the street, Colt Mercer exhaled slowly. The long barrel of his rifle still smoked. His hands were steady. His heart wasn't. Beside him, Mara DeWitt reloaded quickly. She'd taken the second shot. Her eyes didn't flinch as the first bodies dropped. "Think they got the message?" she asked. "They haven't heard the sermon yet," Colt replied. Below, chaos bloomed. Colt's small network, farmers, miners, freedmen and outlaws who had lost too much to stay quiet, sprang into motion. From alleys, they charged the stunned guards. Smoke bombs tossed from windows filled the streets with a haze of ash and fury. Horses reared. Children screamed, but not a single one of Boone's men fired because they didn't know who they were shooting at. That was the plan, to scatter the clarity, to unmask the myth of control. Colt descended from the roof and moved like a shadow through the smoke. He reached the church's side door and found it bolted. 2 kicks broke it open. Inside, the 6 prisoners still stood, hands bound, terror in their eyes. Flames now danced along the floorboards, where Boone's fire had spread faster than planned. "Stay low," Colt commanded. "Follow my voice." One by one he cut their bindings. Mara joined him, coughing as smoke thickened. Together they led the prisoners out the back, while the battle outside raged in confusion. Colt turned once more toward the altar, toward that mocking cross, and stared as fire climbed the walls. He didn't save the church, he let it burn. Boone watched the flames consume the steeple from the edge of the square. 2 of his men lay dead. 4 were wounded. The crowd had vanished. The townspeople had not intervened, had not fought back on his behalf. And worse, they had watched. Eyes from windows, faces from behind barrels and barns. The silence of a town deciding all at once not to protect him. Boone seethed. "This is what he wants," Jeb muttered behind him. "Chaos, fear." Boone's face twisted. "Then we'll give him real fear." That night, while the smoke still drifted over Clearwater Ridge, Boone made a list, not of enemies, but of families. For every man who followed Colt, Boone marked a sister, a child, a cousin who still lived within reach. It wasn't about killing, not yet. It was about reminding them that fire could touch everything. He sent his riders at dawn. No uniforms, no stars, just torches. By the end of the next day, 3 farms outside Dry Bluff were gone. Empty, smoking, silent. And each bore the same message carved into the doorframe. "This is the price of rebellion." Word reached Colt 2 days later. A girl no older than 10 had survived, hidden inside a potato barrel. She was mute now, wouldn't speak, wouldn't cry. Colt knelt beside her in a canvas tent lit by a lantern. He held her hand. She wouldn't look at him. "This is on me. he said to Mara later, voice hollow. No, Mara said, eyes burning. This is on him, but now we know what line he'll cross. Colt nodded. Then we cross one too. The next morning, they raided the southern toll station, the one Boone used to fund the Ridge militia. They didn't just take the gold. They took the records, names, payments, logs of every bribe, every property seizure, every execution order Boone had signed and tried to bury. Colt didn't burn the building. He left it standing. But on the door, in letters scorched with powder, he wrote, "You burn our homes, we expose your kingdom." Boone Cavanaugh sat at his desk that evening, hands trembling as he opened the ledger Colt had left behind. Every secret he'd hidden, every deal he'd made. And he knew. This wasn't war anymore. It was exposure. And exposure burns slower than fire, but it burns to the bone. It was just past midnight when Jeb Cavanaugh woke with a rope around his throat. He didn't scream. Colt's hand was already over his mouth, pressing hard enough to remind him that silence was his best chance at staying alive. The room smelled like whiskey and sweat, and Jeb's boots were still by the bed. He hadn't expected to need them. Colt leaned close, voice low and surgical. "You make a sound, I tighten. Understand?" Jeb nodded, eyes wide, breath short. "Good," Colt whispered. Then everything went dark. Jeb came to in a barn, bound to a support beam with rough hemp rope. A flickering lantern lit the space in sickly orange. It was cold. His jaw ached. His wrists burned. He tugged, but there was no slack. Across from him sat Colt Mercer, silent, cleaning his knife like he was polishing a memory. Mara DeWitt leaned against a post behind him, arms crossed, rifle resting at her hip. Jeb looked at her, tried a grin. "Ma'am!" Mara didn't answer. Colt finally looked up. "You know why you're here?" Jeb swallowed. "Because my brother put a bounty on your head." Colt's voice was calm. "Because you carved my initials into a sycamore tree before burning down my home. Because your men put a little girl in a barrel after torching her family. Because you've watched Boone do things that would make the devil blush, and said nothing." Jeb's smirk faltered. "I didn't burn your house. I swear to God I—" Colt stood, walked forward. In one swift motion, he slammed his boot into the beam beside Jeb's head, splinters flying. Not a strike, just a message. "Don't bring God into this," he said. Jeb's breath quickened. Okay. I was there, all right, but I didn't light it. Wade did. Boone gave the order. You just watched?" Colt asked. "I didn't want to," Jeb shouted. "But Boone, he ain't like the rest of us. He don't fear death. He thinks he's above it. Says he's the judge of this whole land." Mara spoke now. "You ever try to stop him?" Jeb blinked. "You don't stop Boone. You survive him." Colt crouched, eye level now. "Then survive this. Tell us everything." What followed was confession. Tears, shaking, rambling, the unraveling of a man who had spent too many years walking in his brother's shadow, too afraid to stand in the light. Jeb named names, listed safe houses, described a weapons cache hidden beneath the Ridge granary, explained Boone's plan to replace the town council with his hand-picked loyalists next week during a staged riot. The whole town would be placed under martial law, legally on paper, signed by a federal circuit judge Boone had bribed. "He's going to make the war official," Jeb said, "and when he does, he'll hang anyone who ever whispered your name." Colt sat still, letting it settle. Then he stood and reached into his coat. Jeb flinched, expecting steel. But Colt only pulled out a black bandana and tossed it at him. "You're going to walk back into that town," Colt said, "and you're going to wear that over your arm." "What for?" "So the people know who you are." The next morning, Jeb Cavanaugh stumbled into the center of Clearwater Ridge, face bruised, arms free, and a black cloth tied around his left bicep. People stared from behind shutters. Some stepped out into the street. A few followed. Jeb said nothing. He just dropped to his knees outside the courthouse and pulled his shirt down to show the burn scars on his shoulder. He lifted his voice, not loud, not proud, but enough to be heard. "My name is Jeb Cavanaugh. he said. "And I followed evil because I was afraid. I let my brother become a god in a town that stopped believing in justice." More people gathered. I watched families burn. I watched men hanged without trial, and I did nothing. I am not innocent, but I am done being his brother. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Where's Boone?" Jeb looked up, preparing to crown himself king. Gasps, then whispers, then silence again, until a woman stepped forward, an older rancher's widow, face lined like dry riverbeds. She spit at Jeb's feet. "Then you're gonna help us bury him." Boone heard the news an hour later. He was sitting in the back of the town's former schoolhouse, now his command center, when a scout burst in, panting. "Your brother's in the square, talking to the people." Boone stood slowly. "Talking?" he repeated. "Confessing." The color drained from Boone's face. He turned to Wade, who stood by the chalkboard with his leg still braced from Colt's shot at Griffin's Pass. "Go get him," Boone said. Wade hesitated. "You sure we don't just bring him in?" Wade left without another word. Boone walked to the front of the room and picked up a piece of chalk. Slowly, carefully, he wrote 3 words across the board. "Control through fear." Then he turned and stared at it. But something in him flickered. Not fear, but doubt, for the first time. That night, Colt and Mara rode past the burned-out husk of St. Elijah's. The walls were gone, the cross lay charred in the mud. But where the altar once stood, someone had placed a lantern. Inside the glass, a candle still burned. Mara stared at it for a long moment. "You think they're waking up?" she asked. Colt nodded. "They're not just afraid anymore." "And Jeb?" Colt sighed. "He's not innocent, but he didn't have to cry like that. Didn't have to kneel in front of a crowd. That wasn't for us. That was for him." Mara looked at him. "You think he'll flip again?" "I think he already flipped once, too late. The fire's coming. And even if he runs, it'll find him too." She looked toward the distant courthouse, where light still burned in Boone's top window. "You think Boone's watching?" Colt narrowed his eyes. "I hope so. Because now, for the first time since the fire, Colt Mercer wasn't chasing the war. He was leading it. The wind changed at dusk. It swept in from the north, dry and sharp, dragging the scent of rain and smoke. Over Clearwater Ridge, the sky turned the color of a blood bruise, deep purple, angry red, and a sliver of gold like the blade of a knife. Inside the town, doors were barred, windows shuttered, and fires doused. People moved like shadows. They said nothing. They only waited, because they knew. Tonight, the storm wouldn't come from the clouds. It would walk in on boots. Colt Mercer rode alone into the ridge. No coat. No rifle slung high, just his revolver at his side, a matchbox in his pocket, and Emma's letter tucked over his heart. His horse, Cinder, carried only what was needed: powder, rope, and one black bandana tied to the saddle horn. As he passed the saloon, faces peeked through the curtains. As he passed the jailhouse, he saw the last deputy locking himself inside. The church was gone, the courthouse lit, the people silent. At the far end of Main Street stood Boone's militia, 15 men lined like tombstones, and behind them the man himself, Boone Cavanaugh, dressed in full black, his star shining like a dare. His left hand rested on a rifle. His right held a small book of law. "You finally came," Boone said, voice rising. Colt stopped at the center of the street. "I never left," he answered. The men behind Boone shifted nervously. Something was wrong. They had the numbers. They had the guns. But no one else had stepped outside to watch. No crowd, no eyes. Boone looked around, brow furrowing. "Where are the people?" Colt stepped forward. "Behind me." He snapped his fingers, and suddenly the buildings lit up. Rooftops, alleys, doorways. Dozens of silhouettes appeared, rifles in hand. Farmers, widows, laborers, Mara, Harlan. Even Jeb standing at the far end of the street, rifle aimed but not shaking. Boone's men looked to each other, then dropped their guns. One by one they laid them down and stepped back, Boone's mouth twisted. "Cowards," he spat. "You think this makes you free? He'll burn you all down." Colt walked forward, slow, steady, until only 10 feet separated them. "You already burned us," Colt said, "but now it's your turn to feel the heat." Boone raised his rifle. Colt didn't move. A single shot cracked, but it wasn't Colt who fired. It was Mara. Boone stumbled back, shoulder torn, rifle falling. His face twisted in shock as blood seeped through his jacket. "You," he gasped. Mara stepped forward, rifle still warm. "For Asa," she said. Boone staggered, clutching his side. "You can't kill me. I built this town. I made it safe." Colt's voice was calm. "You didn't build a town. You built a throne of ash and fear. But fire doesn't obey kings." Boone reached into his coat. "Not for a weapon. For a matchbook. I'll burn it all before I see you take it." He struck the match. But Colt was already moving. With a single fluid motion he drew and fired. The bullet struck Boone in the thigh. He dropped the match, screamed, fell. Colt walked up and stepped on the match. Boone looked up, face twisted in fury and humiliation. "Go on!" he hissed. "Finish it!" Colt stared down, then reached into his pocket and pulled out Emma's letter. He held it over Boone's chest. "She wanted me to build, to find the light. But she knew. If I couldn't," he lit a match. Held it over the corner of the letter. Boone's eyes widened. Colt let it burn just enough to blacken the edge, then crushed it in his fist. "No," he said, "you don't get to be my ending." He turned, walked away, left Boone bleeding in the dirt. The townsfolk surged forward, not with weapons, but with rope. They didn't cheer, they didn't chant. They bound Boone's hands, stripped his star, and dragged him into the courthouse he once ruled. Jeb Kavanaugh stood at the door. "You'll get a trial," he said. "Real one, honest." Boone sneered. "You think that makes you better?" Jeb looked him in the eye. "No, just cleaner." By midnight the courthouse burned, not in rage, not in chaos, by vote. The people gathered. They chose. They watched the flames take the last symbol of corruption with solemn faces and tearful eyes. And when it was done, they built a fire pit in the town square. A single flame, a circle of lanterns, no speeches, only silence. Colt stood at the edge, watching. Mara joined him. "You did it," she said. "No," Colt replied. "We did," she nudged him. "You gonna stay?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then, "I think I've got one more fire left in me." She raised an eyebrow. "Not the burning kind," he clarified. "The building kind." Mara smiled. "Emma would have liked that." Colt looked to the stars. "I hope so." In the ashes of Clearwater Ridge, something new stirred. Not vengeance, not fear, but the first spark of something clean. And as the wind swept the valley, it carried no more smoke. Only the breath of a town learning to breathe again. The morning after the fire, Clearwater Ridge stood quieter than it had in years. No bells rang, no boots marched down the wooden planks of Main Street, no preacher's voice echoed from the steps of the courthouse, because the courthouse was now a heap of blackened beams and smoldering rubble. The building was gone, but its weight had already lifted from the shoulders of the people. The wind carried a different kind of smoke now. Not the thick, choking clouds of war or judgment, but the soft, curling scent of hearths being lit again, bread rising, coffee boiling, children laughing where they'd once whispered. Rebuilding had begun, not in buildings, but in spirit. And yet, Colt Mercer hadn't spoken a word since the fire. He walked the town slowly that morning, head bare, coat open. The same people who once looked at him with suspicion now gave quiet nods of gratitude. No one shouted his name, no one offered praise. It wasn't that kind of victory. They had won something harder than a battle. They had reclaimed the right to walk their own streets without fear. Still, something inside Colt remained unsettled. He found himself outside Emma's old grave. The marker had been replaced with a fresh plank of cedar, carved gently by Harlan Grady's hand. It now read, "Emma Mercer, beloved wife, the last flame that never went out." Colt stood in silence for a long time. Then he knelt. From his coat, he drew the charred remains of her letter. the one he'd nearly burned before stopping himself. He laid it gently in the grass beside her name. "I thought vengeance would feel cleaner," he whispered. "But it doesn't. Not really." He closed his eyes. "I did what you asked. I found the light. Or maybe the light found me." The wind shifted, brushing across his face like fingers he used to know. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. The sound didn't make him tense. Not anymore. He rose, not as a gunslinger, not as a ghost, but as a man who had lived through fire and chosen not to become it. Later that week, the townsfolk gathered in what remained of the town square. The dirt had been swept, the gallows taken down. No more threats hung in the air. They stood in a wide circle, dozens of them, farmers, widows, orphans, former militiamen, schoolteachers and outlaws, made honest, all waiting, all watching. At the center stood Jeb Kavanaugh, still bruised but taller somehow. The townsfolk had insisted he stand trial, but after Boone's capture, they had offered him a choice: exile or atonement. He'd chosen to stay, and that morning, Jeb stepped forward to speak, his voice trembling but clear. "I don't ask forgiveness," he began, "but I offer truth." He named the names of those who had died unjustly. He confessed to standing still when he should have stood up. He promised to work the land he once tried to steal, and when he finished, the town did not cheer. They only nodded. Because they were no longer a people of fire and fury, they were a people of memory. Later that evening, Mara and Colt stood at the edge of the ridge, looking out across the valley bathed in gold. The sun had dipped just low enough to make the river shine like a ribbon of flame, the good kind. Mara exhaled. "Never thought I'd see a day like this." Colt didn't answer at first. Then, "You think it lasts?" She looked sideways at him. "If we keep walking toward it, maybe." He smiled, the first real smile since Emma's death. "You gonna keep walking beside me?" Mara's answer was quiet. "I already am." They stood in silence for a while longer, until a wagon creaked up the trail behind them. It was driven by Harlan Grady, wearing his old Smith apron, a coil of rope on his lap. "You two just gonna stare at the future, or help me build it?" he called out. Colt and Mara exchanged a glance. Then they turned, walked down the slope, and began the work. In the weeks that followed, Clearwater Ridge transformed. The saloon became a town hall. The old train depot was rebuilt into a school. The church was never replaced with wood. Instead, they marked its foundation with a circle of stones, where people gathered on Sundays not to hear sermons, but to speak their truths. Colt never wore a star, never claimed a title. But when someone asked who they should go to with a dispute or a question, most just said, "Find Mercer. He'll hear you out." One afternoon, a boy of about 12 approached Colt outside the smithy. The boy looked nervous, crumpling a piece of paper in his hands. "Sir?" he asked. Colt looked up from his workbench. "Can I show you something?" The boy handed him a folded sheet. Colt opened it. It was a drawing, crude but powerful. A man in a long coat standing before a burning building. Behind him, a town. And in front of him, written in block letters, he didn't light the fire, but he carried it until we could use it right. Colt looked at the boy. "You draw this?" The boy nodded. Colt smiled. "Keep drawing." The boy grinned and ran off. And Colt sat there for a moment, letting it settle. Not praise, not legend, just truth. On the anniversary of Emma's death, Colt and Mara planted a tree beside her grave, a cottonwood sapling, the kind that could survive fire, the kind that grew wide and strong and shaded everything beneath it. They didn't say anything as they watered it, didn't have to. The earth already understood. That night, Colt stood alone at the ridge again, watching the sun rise, not set. He realized he'd stood in this very spot once before, on the morning after the fire that took everything. But now, the town behind him breathed, and the man standing here was not the same. He had walked through ash. He had held fire in his fists. But when the wind tried to turn him into a match, he had chosen to build, and in doing so, he had proven what Emma already knew. You can't kill the light in a man like that. Not with bullets, not with fire, not even with grief. Because some men burn to destroy, but some men burn to light the way. If this story stirred something in you, a sense of justice, loss, or hope rising from the ashes, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in Colt's place? Leave a comment below and share your perspective. And if stories like this move you, if you believe in tales where fire doesn't just destroy but rebuilds, make sure to subscribe to our channel. There's always another story waiting, just beyond the smoke.